And for a lot of families, what they're experiencing is enmeshment, but they believe that it's intimacy and closeness.
Yeah.
But in order for there to be intimacy, there has to be differentiation. I often talk about in order for there to be healthy attachment, there has to be healthy detachment. And for some family systems, they don't have that. One of the indicators of enmeshment is if children ever felt responsible for their parents' emotional well-being. So if dad was angry, it was my responsibility to do something to medicate or navigate dad's anger. Or if mom was upset, I needed to do something to help her with her upsetness. So now I'm responsible for my parents' emotional well-being. And so now there's that sense of enmeshment where I don't have my own emotions. I am reading other people's emotions and trying to adjust accordingly.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we are happy to be back with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, good to see you as always.
It's good to be here.
And we have a special guest today, one of our all-time favorite reoccurring guests, the clinical director here at Faithful and True, Jim Farm. Jim, how are you?
We should have had this going on about a minute ago when the video started.
when I had other nice things to say about
exactly.
you.
I'm going to tell Daniel to get the thing rolling a little bit earlier.
Keep this rolling. Start this recording a little earlier. Well, we're happy to have Jim back with us today, and we're here today to talk about systems and how it's important to your recovery.
Right.
Yeah, I'm excited to do that because, oftentimes we think about, addiction. We'll hear, is it genetic? Is it, environmentally based? And so when we talk about systems, we're talking about relationship systems, family systems, or church-based systems, or even school-based systems. Those relationships, we have a different environments.
Right. And for the men who have been to the workshop and anyone that is familiar with the trauma egg or what we refer to as the life egg, the thing we talk about is we want men to begin to think about the family system. And so we talk about what were the family rules, what were the family roles. And what we're aware of is for men who are not familiar with, therapy or even some sort of self-reflection, that can be a very foreign idea of what does it mean to have family rules or family roles. But each of those just really emphasize that there's a system. And a system is simply a way to operate. It's the way that the family functions or the church functions or the way the school system functions. And it's this guideline, this perspective, this culture that kind of informs everything that is done.
Yeah. It was a big part of my training, you guys, because there's a form of counseling we call, marriage family therapy, but it's based on systems, and it's a whole way of looking at, why do people behave the way they do, or how do people develop or grow, and systems is a way of thinking about that we all kind of live and work within systems, and the hard thing about systems is once you're in it, like you said, we have rules and roles, and what it becomes kind of solidified. It's kind of like if you ever took science class, if you remember the concept homeostasis, when we talked about that's a system's normal state. Well, families and relationships are like that. Once a normalcy has been created, it's really hard to change, and more times than not, when you try to change a system, or like a family or a relationship, for instance, if we want to change roles or something like that, the system wants to resist it because it wants to stay normal.
Right.
And then whoever's creating the change oftentimes is seen as problematic.
Right. Well, I also think one of the complications is when you're in the system, you have difficulty identifying the system. And, we ask questions like, where did you learn that? Or what causes you to believe that? And a lot of the answers to those questions have to do with the systems I had growing up. And, what's true is when something is operating unconsciously, it really has a lot of influence on our lives. And one of the things I talk to men about is so much of recovery is moving that which has been unconscious into consciousness, because once I'm aware of it, then I can decide if I want to accept it or reject it, if I want to keep doing the things I've been doing, or do I want to begin to do things differently. And probably the best place to start is with the family system, because that's the first one that we experience. And it's what we are born into. And again, it's about the culture of the family, the environment of the family, the rules, the guidelines, just kind of the way the family functions. And I often talk about the family as being like a small business. And there are certain things that have to be done in a small business in order for it to function. And the same thing is true with the family. There are administrative things that need to be done. There are relational issues that need to be taken care of. So there's like the finance department, there's the HR department, and then there's just the purpose of the business, there's the purpose of the family. What is the goal of this? And all of that is operating simply as the family is functioning.
Yeah. I thought one of the things we would talk about today, Greg, is, I was thinking about it this morning, because sometimes we kind of think about, well, what should we talk about? And last minute I thought, well, let's talk.
Well, you have put some thought into this.
I did put a little thought into it today, because I thought Greg was going to be getting ready for his marathon.
Not yet, but yeah.
But anyways, I thought about David Olson was a researcher at the University of Minnesota, and he came up with this model called the circumplex model. And basically it was one way of looking at a system, a family system or a marriage system. And really, if you can think about these two different continuums he really looked at, one had to do with family flexibility in regards to how rigid is the system, or how he described it as chaotic. Like there are no rules. Is the chaotic, and the rigid is the rules are black and white and there's no flexibility.
Right.
It is what it is. And then the other continuum was based on family cohesion, where the system was enmeshed. There wasn't a lot of differentiation within the family. We're all kind of the same. There's just a big we, and there's no I or you in it. And then you had the disengaged family, where there really isn't no we. It's just I and you.
Right.
And it's just a very helpful way to kind of look at systems, because we know, like we talked about earlier, is that if you're on either end of those continuums, on either one of the flexibility or the cohesion, things usually creates a lot of chaos for an individual.
Right. And you know what's interesting is, people who know me know I love a good continuum.
You do?
Because, yeah, I do. Because I think truth is found on a continuum, and to be able to understand that, we could take the flexibility one first, this idea that at one end of the extreme is the very rigid family, and that is the one where there's a lot of rules and expectations, and there's significant consequences if you're stepping outside of the rules. And what's interesting is, for the family, what they believe is that there's safety in the rules. Whereas the other family, the pendulum swings the other way, where there are no guidelines, there are no rules. And, working with men, what is interesting is you can see how there were a lot of men who come through our workshop and they were injured by the rigidness of the family, all of the guidelines, all of the rules, the lack of freedom, the lack of the ability to express an opinion different from somebody else's, and how much pain that has caused. But what is also true is we've had a lot of men come through the workshop, and what they would say is very much what you're saying, is it was chaotic. There was no expectation, or there were very little guidelines. And, it's kind of like you had to figure out life by yourself. And so when children are growing up, one of the principles that we teach is, when boundaries are drawn well, children are safe. And kind of what we're talking about here are the parameters of boundaries. So in the rigid boundaries, or, the boundaries that are too much or too tight, that creates chaos. But at the other end, when the boundaries are too fluid, too open, or there's not enough of the boundaries, that also creates chaos.
Yeah, and sometimes we kind of think about it from an adult perspective, but think about it from a kid's perspective. Like, if you're on that open side of things, like, you have no idea what to expect, but you don't have the cognition to understand what's happening. There's just no expectation.
Right.
It's a very scary feeling for a kid.
Well, and it's because there's this awareness that there's something beyond me that I don't fully understand, and I don't know how to expect. And when we talk about boundaries, I like talking about, like growing up in my house, we had a backyard, and there was a fence that protected the backyard. It clearly define where the backyard was. And there was this sense that as long as I was in the backyard, it was safe. I knew what to expect. It was my area, the fence kept things out, kept me in. So I didn't see the fence as my enemy. It actually was something that kept me safe. But what's true is once I left that fence and went someplace else, there were so many more things that could have happened. There were so many dangers out there. So as a little child, staying inside the fence was a very wise thing to do. Well, if you're a child and you grow up and there is no fence, you don't know where the boundary is, you don't know where the parameters are, anything out there can get you, or you could go too far. That creates its own kind of anxiety. And so for a lot of people, one of the things they have to understand is, though they experienced a lot of freedom, at some point that freedom actually was creating chaos for them because there was too much. There wasn't enough expectation.
Yeah. And I think it hurts them in multiple ways where they end up, crossing other people's boundaries because they're not aware of it, but it also leaves them vulnerable for others to cross their boundaries.
Right. Yeah. If there's no fence, anybody can come into your backyard.
That's
and
right.
if there's no fence, then you can leave your backyard and go someplace else that may not be safe for you or safe for somebody else.
Yeah. So it really ends up being a dangerous situation for, folks that aren't all that safe, tend to kind of target these types of folks that grew up in these environments.
Right. And one of the things that can be true is there's a lot of reasons that someone may grow up in a home where there aren't a lot of boundaries. And one of it may be that both of the parents are very busy and active. Maybe they are both working outside the home, and so the child is left to themselves a lot. Other times there can be an illness. There can be a family member that's struggling with something. There could be a family member that has depression, so they're not able to be active, or a physical ailment, they're not able to be active. And so in those cases, a lot of times the children are left on their own to try to figure things out. And in doing that, they don't necessarily do a good job of it. And, children are not equipped to be wise in their boundaries. That's why they need wise adults helping them to do it.
That's right.
The other thing about this is, as we're talking about this idea of the parameters and the rules and the rigidness or the chaos, boundaries adjust according to the child's growth and maturity. One of the mistakes that children or that parents might make is the same boundaries they had when their child was in elementary school. If they're trying to enforce those same boundaries when they're in high school, that doesn't serve the child, because part of what we're wanting the child to do is to learn how to be free and be wise and make choices for themselves and to be independent.
Yeah.
Well, so it's not just the same boundary works all the time. It's the wisdom of the boundary is going to expand as the child's ability and capacity expands too.
Yeah.
So it's not stagnant, it's fluid and adjusts as the child grows up.
Yeah. And that's what you're really describing, is that being in the middle of that continuum where, we have a level of flexibility, but expectations as well.
Right. And one of the things that, is typically true is when you're in the extremes, it is an attempt to create safety. And so ironically, the parent that is over controlling, there's so many rules, there's so many guidelines, that is about trying to create safety for the child, even though it may actually be hurting the child. But at the other end, the chaotic family that has no rules, no expectations, total freedom, there can be a belief there that too many rules create injury, but no rules, no guidelines, no expectations, or inconsistent guidelines can create injury also. And in some ways, the inconsistent guidelines are some of the most painful thing for a child to navigate.
Yeah, because I think innately they know, or they question, am I cared for?
Right.
And so, but I think, it just brings the point home that oftentimes, these children are being raised that way because it's a reaction from the parents being raised on the one end of the continuum as well. If I'm raised in a rigid environment, I may raise my kids in a very chaotic, open environment.
Right.
Not realizing, well, that's not better.
Right.
If you will, if you want to put that in quotes, it's just a different type of chaos.
Right. And in the middle is where we are cared for, we are nurtured, we are safe. The boundaries grow and expand with us. We are given more freedom, but because of how we've been nurtured and cared for, we have a better capacity to be a good steward of that freedom. Well, let's talk about the other continuum, and that's the one about kind of the relational connection. And so one end is enmeshment. So how would you define enmeshment for somebody?
So enmeshment is really where there isn't a lot of boundaries around the individual members. We're almost seeing like we're all together. Like everything we do, what we think, what we feel should all be kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're all up in each other's business. And I always kind of describe it, there's no privacy.
Right.
You know, and we kind of believe that, you know, and distinguish between secrecy and privacy.
Right.
You know, and sometimes because of their woundedness, they'll just bounce and say, well, you know, we're just all together. We need to be on the same page, where really then it doesn't allow for an individual to be different or to be who God created him to be.
Right.
You know, I often think about, you know, I used to do a lot of coaching for my boys, and I'd run into, every so often I'd run into a kid that you could tell it wasn't his giftedness to be an athlete.
Right.
But his parents wanted him so badly to be an athlete. You know, it's just kind of this enmeshed. Well, we're a sports family. I'm like, he wants to be home playing Legos.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's not a sports guy. You may be.
Right.
You know, but he didn't. The mom or dad may not have had room for that. We're a sports family, so you're going to play baseball.
Right. And for a lot of families, what they're experiencing is enmeshment, but they believe that it's intimacy and closeness.
Yeah.
But in order for there to be intimacy, there has to be differentiation. You know, I often talk about, in order for there to be healthy attachment, there has to be healthy detachment. And for some family systems, they don't have that. You know, one of the indicators of enmeshment is if children ever felt responsible for their parents' emotional well-being. So if dad was angry, it was my responsibility to do something to medicate or navigate dad's anger. Or if mom was upset, I needed to do something to help her with her upsetness. So now I'm responsible for my parents' emotional well-being. And so now there's that sense of enmeshment where I don't have my own emotions. I am reading other people's emotions and trying to adjust accordingly. Yeah. I think you've already alluded to this, but one of the big indicators of enmeshment is when children are not allowed to have their own opinion and their own voice. Mm-hmm. You know, I've heard so many guys say that just to have a different opinion from my parents was seen as being rebellious. Mm-hmm. And if you were to voice a different opinion, that was seen as talking back. And it was also seen as being disrespectful. Mm-hmm. So suddenly, just having an opinion different from my parents is seen as being disrespectful. But the reality is we are different people. God created us to be different. And in the healthy, functioning home, in the middle of the continuum, are children that are allowed to have their own perspective and are safe to express that. Because what we know is healthy development is dependent upon differentiation. You know, we all have to develop that differentiated self, and it's in the family system that we learn that or we don't learn that. And it's important that we're encouraged to have that.
Yeah, and you're right. We go through these developmental stages. I always tell parents this when I'm working with them. We go through stages where we're literally, you know, innately moving towards, you know, wanting to separate ourselves. Mm-hmm. You know, kind of go through a stage early in childhood, and then we kind of see it kind of pick up again in adolescence, where, you know, we kind of, what is it, they call it the terrible threes or
twos.
Terrible twos.
Right.
But then you get into the rebellious adolescence, right? And so it's not rebellion, it's they're trying to sort out who am I, and it's different than you.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But it's seen, like you said, as rebellion or resistance, and it's not, and it's a family's willingness to flex. We'll go back to that continuum, to flex and allow that child to kind of begin to take on some of that.
Right. Well, one of the best gifts we can give our children is the gift of their no. You know, you mentioned the terrible twos and all of the jokes about that. But developmentally, that is one of the places where children begin to find their no. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of parents, they see that as threatening. And one of the things they want to do is take their no away from their child, because right now the only place they use their no is with the parent.
Yeah.
But the reality is children need a no. There's going to be a lot of stuff that comes into their life that's going to be harmful or difficult and challenging, and they need to be able to say no to those things. Mm-hmm. And so that no is a part of that differentiated self. And so in families where children weren't allowed to have an opinion, they weren't allowed to have no, that is a good indication that there's this enmeshment, because the parent was wanting the child to have their perspective, their opinion, you know, and what's true is the child may have some of that, but may also see things differently too. And in functioning families, that differentiation is really acknowledged. On the other end of the pendulum is that separation piece where there's very little or no kind of connection.
Yeah, and we call that, disengaged families where, it's isolation, I used to, when I did family therapy, I'd hear families decide, at night we just all go to our own rooms and nobody knows what anybody else is doing or how their day was. And there's really no interaction. No one could really tell how another person was feeling or even what their thoughts were, or their dreams or hopes were.
Right.
Yeah, that can't be healthy.
Yeah.
Well, and you also hear stories of the family that they were so busy with their schedule, there weren't dinners together. Everybody was just kind of grabbing their food at the same time. And then you were off to the practice or mom or dad was going back to work. And so there's no place of connection. And what can also be true is you do hear of the family that got together for dinner every night. That was very rigid. You had to be home for dinner. But at those dinners, there wasn't open and free conversation. Maybe dad got to talk or maybe mom got to talk, but nobody else got to talk. Or everybody was around the table, but it was very silent, or there were very limited topics that you could talk about. So there wasn't this sense of getting to know each other. And what's also true is kind of the way to describe it is it's four individuals or however many are in the family growing up and living under the same roof, but not a lot of connection with each other.
Yeah.
What can be complicated is even in one family, the pendulum can swing back and forth. So in certain seasons or at certain times, there's this disengagement, but then in other times there's this enmeshment, or in certain relationships there's enmeshment, but in the family system itself there's disengagement.
Yeah, and that really creates chaos for a young child because they don't know what to expect then.
Right.
Yeah.
What's also true, I mentioned this, that if the family is using the language of love, we love each other, families love each other, then what is happening for the child is whatever they're experiencing, they're interpreting it then as love. And so love is, being responsible for somebody else's emotions. Love is enmeshment. Or love is disconnection. Love is silence. Love is limited conversation. So what's challenging for the child is whatever they are experiencing, they believe that is love if that's what they're being told. And so therefore relationships going forward become very complicated and confusing.
Yeah.
In some families, and I can use this as an example from my own family, one of the kind of guidelines, one of the family rules was that if you love someone, you protected them from your pain.
Yeah.
That, isolation was seen as an expression of love because you never wanted to be a bother. One of our family rules is don't be a bother. Well, if you have a need or if you have a problem or you're struggling with something and you share that, then suddenly you become a bother. So now hiding, not being honest, not being transparent is an expression of love. And it took me a while to begin to realize that. And it wasn't until I married Beth and I began to see some different things. And she had different expectations. And she talked about stuff that my family didn't talk about. It was very disorienting because I was being introduced to a new family system that Beth and I were trying to create, while at the same time not fully bringing all of my old family system into my new marriage.
Yeah. I mean, we run into this quite a bit. It's, I often have guys think about this from a child's standpoint because sometimes we'll think about it from who we are now, and we tend to minimize things when we do that. But one of the things we'll run into is, for instance, if a guy gets exposed to pornography as a young child, and he's in a family system that's disengaged, there's not a lot of emotional connection or safety around that, and God forbid it's a very rigid environment, think about it from a child's standpoint. Is, first of all, I don't feel safe enough sharing this with you. And then if I do share it with you, I may get in trouble.
Right.
So what am I going to do?
Yeah.
I'm going to split that part of myself off, and I'm just going to share the part of me that I think you are going to love or accept.
Well, and hiding becomes part of the survival strategy.
Yeah.
What's interesting is you're saying this is that when a child is exposed to something sexual, however that child is experiencing the family system impacts what the child does with that. And if they feel safe enough, they may bring it and start talking. I hear those stories of kids who were exposed to pornography and they were able to bring it to their parents. or kids who were caught looking at pornography and the way their parents responded. Well, what could be true is if the parents respond in a regulated, generous, kind, open, curious way and kind of inviting the child into a safe space to talk about it, that experience is going to be different than the child who gets caught or talks about it and it's about fear and shame. Suddenly it's about the family image and it's about these other things, not about the child and the child's needs and the child's curiosity and desire. And so that's a great place to understand either what I believed would happen or what did happen when I was exposed. That is my understanding of the family system itself. Mm-hmm. Did I feel safe enough to talk about this? Did I feel safe enough to push past my shame to include other people in this? And if I didn't believe I was safe enough or I didn't believe that they could handle it, typically I wouldn't tell anybody about it.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, but I do want to also acknowledge, just like there's a family system, all organizations have systems. Mm-hmm. And for many of our listeners and a lot of the men that come through Faithful and True and the women also, one of the dominant systems they experienced growing up was the church system. Yeah. And so just like families have these two continuums, a church would have these two continuums. One would be the enmeshed, and one would be the disconnected. And so where was that church experience on that? And for a lot of people, what they discover as adults is there was a lot of enmeshment in their church system. They called it fellowship, they called it community, but it was a very enmeshed environment of compliance and kind of losing your sense of self, acquiescing to the identity, all of those types of things where you weren't allowed to be your own person. And then with church systems, there could be one end of the continuum where there were a lot of rules, it was very rigid, or the other end where it was very open and chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. And once again, if you go back from a kid's perspective, and if that's the church system you're growing up in, now that depicts who God is.
Right, exactly.
And so he's rigid then,
right.
And he's, all, enmeshed or disengaged. And so we have to keep going back, how was I experiencing it as a child rather than, just looking at it and minimizing it from an adult's perspective.
Right. Well, and when we're working with when we're working with the men and women who come through here, one of the things, as we're talking about our relationship with God, for those of us who grew up in the church, we've been told what to believe about God. We've been given language to discuss God. But if you really want to know how you relate to God, you go back to how do I relate to my parents? Mm-hmm. What are my beliefs about God? We often ask the question, what would God be like if God is like my dad? Mm-hmm. And what would God be like if God is like my mother? Because those two people were the prominent authorities in my life and my first expression of power and authority. And so I'm immediately going to assume whatever is true about them is going to be true about God. No matter what words I'm being given, those are my experiences. And then like you've identified, however I experience God at the church and however I experience people at the church informs my understanding of God. So, a man comes to the workshop and what we begin to realize is his relationship with God is really very closely understood in the context of how he related to his parents and whatever type of experiences he had at the church.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge ramifications because, we hear it all the time, like, I don't believe in God. What is, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And basically when I hear that is, I hear pain from their church experience.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things I say at the beginning of each of the workshops is Faithful and True is a place of faith. Those of us who work here have faith. And for those of us who have been in recovery, I would say for all of us, faith has been an important part of our recovery. But the key is it is our faith. Mm-hmm. And we're never going to impose that on somebody else. We're never going to demand something. Because we know a lot of men and women who come through Faithful and True, they've actually been hurt and injured by the way that they were introduced or experienced faith growing up, and we don't want to recreate that or duplicate that. So we are going to be open and honest about our faith. We're going to lead out of the scripture, but we also want to remind people that it is our faith, and we simply want to invite people to explore their own spirituality, their own faith journey, versus giving them some simple solution or imposing something on them. Mm-hmm. Because this is a part of the recovery process, is engaging who am I and who am I in relationship with God?
Mm-hmm. One of my mentors at seminary he was just an incredible guy, but one of his statements that he said was just so impactful. He said, you guys have to release the God of your childhood and get to know the God of your adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know?
Well, in closing, because I know we're out of time.
Thank you so much.
So in closing, the invitation is for those of you who are listening to the podcast to maybe reframe how you've experienced your family, how you experienced church, school, and really begin to ask, what was the system like? What were the guidelines? What were the rules? Were we at one end of the continuum where it was very rigid, or were we at the other end where it was chaotic? And what was the nature of relationship? Was it enmeshed? Was it disengaged? Because those things are going to shape and form how I live as an adult.
Yeah, and like you've said before, Greg, we don't do that to blame. It's for it's for our awareness and to be able to have some redemption through our experience.
Absolutely.
Well, Jim, thank you for joining Greg and me today. This has been a great conversation. I'm sure our listeners and viewers have appreciated today's message. We hope that you will visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many more information and many more opportunities to learn about our 3-day intensive workshops and online registration for those events. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.